The rhythmic, metronomic beep of the heart monitor was the only clock I had in this sterile, white purgatory. It counted down the seconds of my brother's life. 3 days I'd been sitting in this stiff plastic chair watching Leo waste away, and the sound had wormed its way into my skull. It was the soundtrack to my failure. Leo looked like a faded photograph of himself. He was 19, all gangly limbs and a shock of sandy hair that used to drive girls crazy. Now, his skin had a translucent, waxy quality, stretched tight over the sharp angles of his bones. His hair was thin and lank on the pillow. The official diagnosis, delivered by a hematologist with tired eyes and a voice full of professional sympathy, was an idiopathic ultra-aggressive subtype of aplastic anemia, a $5 way of saying his bone marrow had just quit. His absolute neutrophil count was under 200. His body had forgotten how to make blood. It was a 1 in a million disease, they said. A statistical tragedy. But I knew better. Beneath the antiseptic smell of the hospital, beneath the low hum of the machines, I felt it. A cold. It wasn't the chill of the air conditioning. It was a deep, predatory cold that clung to Leo like a shroud. It was the signature of the veil, the hidden frequency of the world my family had been cursed to perceive. Something from that other side had its hooks in him, its influence echoing in his cells, poisoning him in a way no microscope could see. I was a sentinel, a descendant of the Whitaker bloodline, and my resonance screamed that this wasn't a disease. It was an attack. The doctors had given him a month, maybe less. They'd thrown everything at him: immunosuppressants, blood transfusions, experimental growth factors. Nothing worked. Hope, in the medical sense, was a flatlining commodity. So, I had turned to the only other option I had. The one my father had warned me was a darker path than any other. The Codex. Back at my cramped Boston apartment, the ancient leather-bound book sat open on my kitchen table. For generations, it had been our family's burden and our only weapon. A compendium of monsters, a manual for fighting the things that lurked in the veil. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with spidery script detailing the physiology of creatures men called myths. It spoke of curses that mimicked disease, of spiritual taints that manifested as physical decay. Under a section on sanguine vitiation, a corruption of the blood, a single desperate remedy was mentioned. It wasn't a potion or a ritual. It was a source, the regenerative infusion, possible only from the vitae of a vampire patriarch, an elder. The thought of dealing with one of them made my stomach clench. They were the top of the food chain, creatures of immense power and intellect who saw humans as little more than livestock or pawns. But for Leo, I would bargain with the devil himself. Using a protocol from the Codex, I found my point of contact. It wasn't a phone number or an email. It was an old, dusty bookstore in the North End, a place called Oakhaven Tomes. The air inside smelled of decaying paper and forgotten stories. The proprietor was a thin, ageless man who never looked me in the eye. Following the Codex instructions, I found a first edition of Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana. On page 66, I drew a small, specific sigil, a crescent moon pierced by a vertical line, using a charcoal pencil. I paid for the book in cash and left. It was a quiet declaration, a request for an audience sent into the city's hidden web. The answer came 2 nights later. I returned from another draining vigil at the hospital to find a single heavy-stock business card slid under my apartment door. It was obsidian black with no name, no number, just an address in the Seaport District and a time, 11 p.m. The address led to a sleek, modern skyscraper of glass and steel. a monument to new money. The penthouse. The elevator opened directly into the living space, and the sheer scale of it was meant to intimidate. A wall of glass offered a god's eye view of Boston Harbor, the city lights glittering like a carpet of scattered diamonds. The room was a museum of contradictions. A Rothko hung across from a haunting Renaissance portrait. A sterile modern sculpture stood on a 17th century Persian rug. The air was still heavy and charged with an ancient authority that had nothing to do with wealth. He was standing by the window, his back to me. When he turned, he looked to be in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored Italian suit, with dark hair and a face that was too perfect, too symmetrical. But his eyes were old. They held the cold, patient weight of centuries. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly inhuman. "Cole Whitaker," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. This was Julian Valerius, the Shadow Prince of Boston. Former 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 tours in Afghanistan, an honorable discharge. And now you sit by your brother's bed and watch him die. My hand instinctively tightened into a fist. "You know why I'm here?" "I do," Julian said, gesturing to a leather armchair. I remained standing. Leo Whitaker, 19, a tragic case of aplastic anemia, or so his doctors believe. You, however, feel the truth of it, don't you? The echo. He savored the word. His intelligence network was as flawless as the legends claimed. "Can you fix it?" My voice was tight, raw. "Fix it?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "What is broken can be mended. What has been hollowed out, however, must be refilled. I can do more than fix it. I can perform what my kind call a regenerative infusion. I can rewrite the corrupted code in his blood, purge the echo, and restore him. He would wake up as if from a long, bad dream, completely whole. The relief that washed over me was so potent it almost buckled my knees. But it was immediately followed by a cold dread. A creature like this did nothing for free. "What's the price?" Julian walked to a massive, polished mahogany bar and poured 2 glasses of something dark red. He offered one to me. I ignored it. "The price," he said, taking a slow sip, "is a service. Your particular set of skills, Mr. Whitaker, is of interest to me." He paced back toward the window. "There is a delicate balance to our world, the one you call the veil. I cultivate order. It is good for business, and it keeps the human world blissfully unaware. However, some elements prefer chaos. A clan of lycanthropes who call themselves the Ashwood Pack has taken root in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. They have grown bold, feral. They are attacking my couriers, disrupting my operations, and their savagery is drawing unwanted attention. They are a threat to the stability I have so carefully maintained." "You want me to scare them off?" I said, my ranger training kicking in, assessing the mission parameters. Julian turned, and for the first time his mask of civility slipped. His eyes held a flicker of cold, absolute fire. "No," he said softly. "I want them gone, eradicated. I want you to go into their territory and exterminate the entire pack. Their alpha, their females, their young. Leave nothing but ash and bone. This is not a negotiation. It is a pest control problem." My blood ran cold. He wasn't asking me to be a soldier. He was asking me to be an executioner. To slaughter a whole family, a whole community of them, even if they were monsters. "When you are finished," he continued, his voice returning to its smooth, businesslike tone, "you will bring me a token of your success, the fang of the Alpha, a proof of contract." He saw the conflict in my face, the revulsion. He walked back to the bar and retrieved a small sealed silver flask, no bigger than my thumb. It glinted under the recessed lighting. "An advance," he said, placing it on the table between us. "A show of good faith. This contains a stabilizing agent. It will not cure your brother, but it will halt the progression of his illness. It will buy him a few weeks. It will buy you the time you need to complete your task." I stared at the flask. It represented a few more weeks of that rhythmic beeping. A few more weeks of Leo breathing. A choice between my soul and my brother's life. It wasn't a choice at all. My principles were a luxury I could no longer afford. I reached out and took the flask. The metal was cold to the touch. "I'll do it," I said, my voice hollow. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I was making a deal with one monster to go hunt others. Julian smiled, a true predatory smile this time. "I knew you would, Mr. Whitaker. A brother's love is such a powerful, predictable motivator." Later that night, I slipped back into the hospital during the dead hour between nursing shifts, a $20 bill left on the right desk, ensuring the night nurse was conveniently occupied elsewhere. I disabled the door alarm with a trick I'd learned for bypassing magnetic locks. Leo was asleep, his breathing shallow. I drew the contents of the silver flask into a syringe. The liquid was faintly iridescent, like oil on water. With a practiced hand, I found the port in his IV line and pushed the plunger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint touch of color returned to his cheeks. The frantic, shallow rhythm of his breathing deepened, smoothed out. The change was subtle, but it was real. It was proof. Looking at his peaceful face, I felt no relief. Only the cold, heavy weight of the contract I had just signed in blood. The drive out of Boston was a blur of highway lights and gnawing guilt. I didn't head south toward West Virginia. Not yet. I drove west into the rolling hills of rural Massachusetts to a place I hadn't seen in 5 years. The old Whitaker homestead. The truck rumbled down a gravel road overgrown with weeds, its headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a 2-story colonial house sagging under the weight of time and neglect. Paint peeled from the siding like sunburnt skin. This was where my father had raised us, where he had taught me the truth of our lineage, and where, after he died, I had locked the door and walked away, trying to escape the legacy he'd left me. I let myself in, the air inside stale and thick with the ghosts of memory. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I went straight to the basement, to the back wall behind a rusted water heater. I pressed a sequence of seemingly random stones in the foundation, and with a low groan of protesting mechanics, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, descending staircase. The air that rose to meet me was the scent of my inheritance. Gun oil, aging leather, and the sharp, sterile tang of strange chemicals. This was the true heart of the house, the Whitaker Armory. It wasn't a room, it was a workshop and a vault. A long wooden workbench ran along one wall, scarred and stained from generations of use. On it, I laid the codex, its heavy leather cover thudding softly in the quiet. I turned the brittle pages until I found the chapter I needed, De Lycanthropus. For hours, I studied. The text, a mix of Latin and archaic English, was chillingly practical. It detailed their physiology, the hyper-accelerated metabolism, the bone restructuring process of the change, the senses that could smell fear and track a blood trail for miles. It described their psychology, fiercely territorial, bound by a rigid pack hierarchy, their actions dictated by the will of their alpha, and it detailed their vulnerabilities. Silver, the book confirmed, caused agonizing pain by disrupting their regenerative abilities on a cellular level. But a poorly placed shot wouldn't be a kill. It would just make them angry. For a true systemic kill, the Codex recommended more potent agents. Mercury for its neurotoxicity, the flowering plant known as wolfsbane, or aconite for its paralytic effect on their unique nervous system, and of course fire. My work began. This was not a job for off-the-shelf ammunition. I fired up the small forge in the corner. I had the raw materials stockpiled, pure silver ingots and lead. My hands, guided by muscle memory, moved with a grim purpose. For my Marlin 1895 guide gun, I cast heavy 45, 70 slugs. For my primary sidearm, a customized 44 Magnum revolver, I cast hollow points. But these weren't simple silver bullets. The old text spoke of mercury, but my father had improved the formula. The hollow cavity of each slug I carefully filled with a thick, viscous resin I mixed on the bench. A concentrated, stabilized extract of aconite, thickened with a binding agent. On impact, the silver would burn, and the resin would deliver a payload of poison directly into the bloodstream. It was a vicious, deadly combination. Next, my knife. My old Ka-Bar, the one that had been with me through my tours, its leather handle worn smooth by my grip. I sharpened the carbon steel blade until it could shave hair. Then I heated it gently over an alcohol flame and repeatedly quenched it in a jar of pure, undiluted wolfsbane tincture, letting the poison bake into the very pores of the metal. I packed my gear into a large canvas rucksack. Several flashbang grenades, a standard military issue, but I'd modified them. I'd carefully pried them open and mixed fine silver powder in with the explosive compound, turning them into shrapnel charges of burning light and agony. A high-intensity ultraviolet flashlight, the Codex noted some lesser lycanthropes had a photosensitivity similar to vampires, and it was better to be prepared. My medkit was filled not with gauze and antiseptic, but with silver nitrate powder for cauterizing wounds a werewolf might inflict, and a set of auto-injectors filled with a stimulant cocktail of my own design. A brutal mix of adrenaline and a proprietary herbal compound that would heighten my resonance, allowing me to better sense the veil, at the cost of burning me out later. Just as I was finishing, a notification pinged on my encrypted satellite phone. A message from an unknown number. It was from Julian. A single line of text. Black Creek, West Virginia. A former mining town. Disappeared from maps after the no. 3 shaft collapsed in 74. Estimated pack size, 15, 20. Do not fail. 15 to 20. Against 1 man. The odds were suicidal. I knew Julian's information was likely incomplete, possibly even a deliberate lowball to test my mettle. He didn't care if I died, as long as I took the pack with me. Before I could allow doubt to creep in, I undertook one final preparation, a ritual from the Codex. I sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor of the armory, the loaded magnum in my lap, and focused on my breathing. It was a form of meditation designed to sharpen the resonance, to attune my senses to the frequency of the veil. As my mind quieted, the world around me seemed to dim, and the hidden world flared. I could feel the lingering psychic residue in the room, the fear and determination of my ancestors. To fuel my resolve, I pulled a worn photo from my wallet. It was me and Leo years ago at a lake house. I was 16, he was 6. I was holding him on my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera, sunlight glinting off the water behind us. Happy, safe, innocent. I stared at the picture until the memory was a fire in my gut. This was why. This was the only thing that mattered. The cold fury that filled me was a welcome friend. It was clean. It was simple. Before I left, I drove back to Boston one last time. I didn't go in. I couldn't. I just parked across the street from the hospital, looking up at the single-lit window of Leo's room. I pictured him sleeping, the stabilizer Julian had given me holding the line against the encroaching darkness. I couldn't say goodbye, not even silently. It felt too final. Instead, I made a promise. I put the truck in gear and turned south. The hunt was on. The drive south was a descent. The crisp, familiar landscapes of New England bled into the dense, brooding forests of the Appalachian Mountains. The further I drove, the heavier the air felt. My resonance, which had been a low hum in Boston, was now a persistent, thrumming vibration at the base of my skull. It was like listening to a bass note just beyond the range of hearing, a pressure that signaled I was entering a place where the veil was thin and worn. This land was old, and it held old things. My destination, Black Creek, didn't exist on any modern GPS. I had to rely on old paper maps and Julian's coordinates. The last bastion of civilization was a town called Red Rock, a dozen miles from my target zone. It was a dying place, clinging to the side of a mountain like a desperate man on a ledge. A single gas station with rusting pumps, a dive bar with a flickering neon sign, and a handful of houses with peeling paint and suspicious eyes staring out from behind drawn curtains. When I pulled my truck up to the gas station, the attendant, a gaunt man with a permanent look of unease, watched me as if I were a tax auditor. "Fill her up?" he asked, his voice a gravelly drawl. "And a couple of extra cans if you have them," I said, handing him a wad of cash. He eyed my truck, my gear in the back. "You ain't from around here. Lost?" "Just exploring," I lied smoothly. "Heard there were some old ghost towns up in these hills. Thought I'd do some photography." His face tightened. "Ain't nothing for you up there. Folks who go poking around the old Black Creek mines, they don't always come back. Best you turn around." Later, in the town's only bar, the Rusty Pick, I tried to pry more information from the bartender, a heavy-set man named Earl who polished the same glass for 10 minutes straight. I ordered a beer I didn't drink and fed him the same story about being an urban explorer. "Bad idea," he grunted, not looking at me. "That place is bad medicine. My granddaddy used to say the devil himself clawed his way out of the ground there." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Hunters who get too close talk about things in the woods. Things that ain't natural. Tracks the size of dinner plates. Devil dogs, they call them. Big as bears with eyes that glow in the dark." He straightened up abruptly, as if catching himself. "Drunken stories. Pay him no mind." But I saw the fear in his eyes. It was real. The locals knew. They didn't understand what it was, but they knew to stay away. The next morning, I left the truck hidden in a dense thicket of trees several miles from Black Creek and went in on foot. I found what used to be a road, now little more than a scar on the landscape, choked with saplings and thorns. The feeling of being watched was immediate and overwhelming. My resonance was a constant high-pitched scream in my mind, a proximity alert telling me I was surrounded. The first physical proof came a mile in. The carcass of a black bear lay in the middle of the path. It hadn't been hunted for food. It had been torn apart, its massive rib cage ripped open with a strength that defied nature. The ground around it was churned up, littered with huge canine paw prints that were fundamentally wrong. 5 toes like a dog's, but the shape was too long, too much like a distorted human hand. The forest itself seemed sick. The trees were unnaturally twisted, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching for a gray, oppressive sky. There were no birds. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dead leaves on the ground, a sound like a final, drawn-out breath. The air, thick and humid, carried a coppery tang of old blood and a heavy animal musk that made the hairs on my arms stand up. This was their sanctuary, a place where they felt safe, and where anything else was an intruder. I moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man navigating a minefield. I found their territorial markers clawed into the bark of ancient oaks, deep, parallel gashes 8 feet off the ground, far too high for any natural predator. Clumps of coarse gray and black fur were snagged on the thorns of briar patches. These weren't just animals. They were intelligent. They were organized. They were marking the borders of their kingdom. Following the markers led me toward a valley shrouded in a perpetual mist. Through the trees I could see them, the skeletal remains of buildings. The ghost town of Black Creek, a collapsed church steeple, the hollowed-out shells of houses, the rusted skeleton of a mine head frame. But I didn't go in. That would be suicide. Julian's intel said 15 to 20 of them. A direct assault was out of the question. I needed to be a ghost, a whisper. I needed to know my enemy. I backtracked and scaled a sheer rock face on the valley's edge, finding a high, defensible outcropping of stone that offered a commanding view of the town below. It was shielded from the elements by an overhang, with a clear line of sight and only one approach. A perfect sniper's nest, a perfect observation post. I set up a cold camp, no fire, no light. I unrolled my camouflage tarp, laid out my gear, and took out my high-powered binoculars. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange, I settled in, my rifle resting on its bipod beside me. The hunt had been the journey here. Now the surveillance began. I would watch. I would learn. And I would wait for them to show me how to kill them. For 2 days and 2 nights, I lived on that rocky perch. I subsisted on protein bars and cold water, moving only to relieve myself or to shift position to ease my aching muscles. Sleep came in brief, 20-minute snatches, my senses on a razor's edge. Through the powerful lenses of my binoculars, Black Creek became my entire world. During the day, the town was a tomb. Nothing moved. I knew they were there, sleeping in their human forms somewhere below, in the cool darkness of the mine or the cellars of the ruined houses. But when night fell, the tomb came alive. They emerged as the last light died, not as men, but as monsters. The transformation, even from this distance, was a silent, horrifying ballet. They were bipedal, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with powerful digitigrade legs, long arms ending in wicked black claws, and heads that were a perfect, nightmarish fusion of wolf and man. They moved with a terrifying combination of speed and coordinated purpose. I watched them form up into patrols, 3-member teams that methodically swept through the ruins, their movements not like a pack of animals, but like a trained fire team clearing a hostile village. My blood ran cold. The bartender's drunken stories were an understatement. These were not feral beasts. This was an infantry unit. Silas, their alpha, had trained them. The logic patch from my own intel brief clicked into place. Silas must have a military background. He'd imposed discipline on their primal savagery. I counted them. 3 patrols of 3. That was 9. Julian's estimate of 15 to 20 was looking more and more accurate. I needed to test their response, their strength, their ferocity, but on my terms. A frontal assault was madness, but a calculated ambush could give me the data I needed. On the third night, I put my plan into action. I had spent the afternoon preparing a kill zone in a narrow bottleneck gorge about half a mile from the town, a natural choke point on one of the patrol routes. I'd also prepared my bait. Earlier, I'd shot a deer, and I'd drenched a large cut of its meat in a chemical cocktail from my kit. A synthetic compound designed to mimic the scent of pure, unadulterated terror. To a lycanthrope's senses, it would be an irresistible lure. I placed the bait just past the gorge and settled into a concealed position 30 yards up the canyon wall, my Marlin rifle resting steady on a rock. Then I waited. An hour after moonrise, they came. A 3-man team, moving with that same eerie, silent confidence. They were following their usual path when the lead creature stopped dead. Its head snapped up, nostrils flaring. It caught the scent. A low growl rumbled from its chest, and it nudged its companions. Greed and predator's instinct overrode their discipline. They broke from their patrol route and loped towards the bait, entering the gorge single file. They were halfway through when the first one's foot snagged the tripwire I'd staked low to the ground. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was brutally effective. A modified M18 Claymore, a gift from an old EOD tech buddy from the 75th named Spooky, who dealt in off-market party favors, unleashed a fan-shaped wave of silver ball bearings at waist height. The sound ripped through the silent forest. The lead werewolf was shredded from the legs up, collapsing in a heap of mangled flesh and fur. The second one was peppered with shrapnel and thrown against the canyon wall, howling in agony. The third, shielded by the others, was knocked off its feet, stunned and disoriented. The stun lasted less than 2 seconds. The third werewolf was back on its feet with a roar of pure rage, its yellow eyes locking onto my position instantly. It ignored its fallen comrades and charged, covering the 30 yards of rocky ground in a terrifying blur of motion. I had him in my sights. I squeezed the trigger. The 45, 70 slug, filled with aconite resin, hit it square in the chest. The impact was like a sledgehammer. It staggered, a black, steaming hole erupting in its torso, but it didn't fall. It let out a gurgling shriek and kept coming. Before I could chamber another round, it was on me. A 7-foot, 400-pound wall of muscle and fury slammed into me, knocking the rifle from my hands. I was pinned, the creature's hot, fetid breath washing over my face. The smell was of blood, wet fur, and rot. Its claws, thick as daggers, tore through the ballistic fabric of my vest, screeching against the ceramic plate underneath. I felt the pressure, heard my ribs creak. My right arm was pinned, but my left was free. I fumbled for the K-bar sheathed on my belt. My fingers closed around the worn leather handle. With a desperate grunt, I swung the blade up and plunged it deep into the monster's side, just under its ribcage. The effect of the poison-laced steel was immediate and violent. It threw its head back and screamed, a sound of inhuman pain that echoed off the canyon walls. The grip on me loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all the time I needed. I twisted my body, shoving with my legs, and rolled out from under the beast. As I scrambled to my feet, I drew my magnum. The werewolf was turning, its face a mask of snarling hate, black blood and foam dripping from its jaws. I didn't hesitate. I raised the revolver, aimed for the center of its head, and fired. The heavy slug blew the back of its skull out in a spray of bone and gore. It stood for a silent, swaying moment before crashing to the ground. My ears were ringing. My chest was a riot of pain. I limped over to the other two. The first one from the claymore was dead. The second, the one peppered with shrapnel, was trying to drag itself away, leaving a thick trail of black blood. It turned its head and looked at me. In its glowing eyes, I saw more than just animal fury. I saw intelligence. I saw hatred. I saw a being that knew exactly what I was and what I had done. These weren't just beasts. They were people. The thought was a cold spike in my gut. But then, the image of Leo, pale and dying in his hospital bed, flashed in my mind. The deal was made. The price had to be paid. I raised the magnum and put a final merciful round into its head. Standing there in the sudden silence, surrounded by the dead, I took stock. Deep gouges on my arms, at least 2 cracked ribs. I was breathing hard, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. And a chilling realization. I had used overwhelming firepower and the element of surprise to take down 3 of them, and I had almost died. Almost. A direct fight with the whole clan was not just suicide. It was an impossibility. I had to change the plan. I couldn't just be a hunter. I had to be an exterminator. And for that, I needed to find their nest. The lesson from the ambush was brutal and clear. Fighting them on their terms was a fool's errand. I couldn't outfight them, so I had to outthink them. My new objective was singular and absolute. Find their lair. Find the heart of the pack, the place they felt safest, and turn it into their tomb. My gut and the town's history pointed to one place, the old Black Creek. No. 3 Mine, the one whose collapse had wiped the town off the map. Before leaving the gorge, I did something that turned my stomach. I searched the bodies. They were already beginning to revert, the monstrous forms shrinking and contorting back into human shapes. They were men, no older than me. Tucked inside the waistband of one's pants, I found a small, crudely made pouch. Inside was an amulet, carved from what looked like deer bone and a tattered piece of a photograph. It showed a smiling woman holding a baby. I dropped it as if it were burning coals. These weren't just soldiers. They were people with lives, with families. The thought made the deal with Julian feel even filthier, but it was too late for moral objections. My brother's life hung in the balance. I didn't follow the main path back to Black Creek. Instead, I shadowed the route of another patrol from a safe distance, moving through the dense undergrowth, using the wind and terrain to mask my scent and sound. They moved with a grim purpose, their path eventually leading them to the rusted, skeletal headframe of the main shaft of the Black Creek. No. 3 Mine. This was it. To get a better picture, I fell back to a secure location and deployed my secret weapon. A small, consumer drone I'd heavily modified. It was painted in camouflage, its rotors baffled for quieter flight, and I'd fitted it with a high-resolution thermal imaging camera. Launching it from over a mile away, I piloted it high above the valley, a silent eye in the sky. The thermal view confirmed everything. The ruins of the town were cold, lifeless stone. But the area around the mine entrance pulsed with heat signatures. I watched as patrols entered and exited, their bodies glowing bright white against the cool blue of the rock. They were using the main entrance, as well as a couple of smaller, concealed ventilation shafts higher up the mountain. But as I scanned the mountainside, I spotted an anomaly. A single dark spot on the thermal image. A cold signature. An old collapsed adit, a horizontal entrance, that the geological survey maps had marked as sealed since the 1950s. The pack was ignoring it, likely assuming it was impassable. It was my way in. That night, under the cover of a brewing storm that would mask any noise, I made my move. Using climbing gear, I rappelled down the slick rock face to the forgotten entrance. It was almost completely buried by a rock slide, just a small gap remaining at the top. For 2 agonizing hours, I worked in the dark, painstakingly removing rocks and debris by hand, my muscles screaming in protest. Every falling pebble sounded like a gunshot to my paranoid ears. Finally, I cleared a space just large enough to squeeze through. The air inside was foul, a thick, suffocating blanket of stale air, damp earth, and something else. The distant, musky, cloying scent of the pack. I was inside the beast's gut. With a headlamp switched to a low-power red light setting to preserve my night vision, I moved deeper into the earth. The tunnels were narrow, treacherous, and shored up with rotting timbers that looked ready to collapse at any moment. On my ruggedized tablet, I began to build a map using the drone's thermal overlay and my own progress to chart the labyrinth. I moved with a ranger's stealth, every footstep placed with surgical precision. The reek of them grew stronger. I found their larder first, a cavernous pit filled with the gnawed-on bones of deer, bear, and, to my horror, what were unmistakably human remains. The floor was sticky with dried blood. Deeper still, I found their dens. Several large chambers branched off the main tunnel where they slept during the day. The ground was littered with crude nests of blankets, straw, and old clothes. This is where they were vulnerable, in their human forms. For a cold second, I considered the idea of coming back, of executing them in their sleep. But I couldn't. Not like that. And I still needed the Alpha's Fang. Finally, I followed the main tunnel to its end. It opened into a massive cathedral-like cavern, clearly the heart of their domain. A natural throne of rock dominated the far end. And on it I saw him. Even in his human form, he was immense. A giant of a man, his body a roadmap of old scars. His presence was a palpable force, an aura of raw, primal authority that pressed down on me even from 100 yards away. This was the Alpha. Silas. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on his stone throne, awake and alert, his head bowed. He was examining something small and metallic in his hands, turning it over and over. He was the key. He was the one Julian wanted dead. I had found their heart. Now I just had to figure out how to cut it out. Finding a secure, hidden niche high in the cavern wall, I settled in. The reconnaissance was over. The observation had begun. I remained in that dark, cold recess in the rock for the better part of a day, a silent observer perched like a vulture above the floor of the cavern. It was a test of endurance, a battle against muscle cramps, hunger, and the crushing need for sleep. From my vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of Silas and the main chamber, the Pack's throne room. I watched him, studying his every move, the way the others deferred to him, the grim, coiled spring tension in his posture. He was a king in his castle of stone and shadow. As dusk approached, the rest of the Pack began to stir. They gathered in the main cavern, and I witnessed their ritual. It wasn't the instantaneous special effects-laden transformation of movies. It was a drawn-out, agonizing process of biological violence. I heard the sickening crack and pop of bones breaking and reforming, saw flesh stretch and tear. Their screams of pain morphed into guttural, bestial snarls as their bodies contorted into the monstrous forms I'd seen before. The air filled with the coppery scent of their blood. It was horrifying, and a stark reminder that their power came at a terrible physical price. Once the change was complete, 2 of the largest werewolves, clearly his lieutenants, approached Silas on his throne. They kept a respectful distance. Using a small, highly sensitive directional microphone connected to my earpiece, I was able to pick up fragments of their speech. It wasn't just growls and snarls. It was a language, harsh and guttural, but a language nonetheless. "No sign of the relic," one of them growled, the sound like grinding stones. "The vampire's couriers carry nothing," said the other. "He mocks us, he hides it." Silas finally looked up from the object in his hand. "The bloodsucker will pay for his treachery," he snarled, his voice a low, commanding thunder that vibrated through the rock. "He stole the moon gift from my mate's grave. An eye for an eye. A life for a life. We will choke his operations. We will bleed him dry until he returns what is ours." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. A moon gift. A relic. Julian hadn't just wanted this clan gone because they were disrupting the balance. He'd robbed them. He'd desecrated the grave of the Alpha's mate and stolen something sacred to them, a powerful artifact. The Ashwood Pack's aggression wasn't random chaos, it was targeted retribution. They weren't rabid dogs. They were a wronged people fighting a war of vengeance. And Julian had sent me, a human, to be his unknowing, disposable assassin. He'd lied, manipulated me, and pointed me like a loaded gun at the heart of a grieving, vengeful husband. A wave of white-hot rage washed over me, so intense I had to bite down on my own hand to keep from making a sound. I had been played for a fool. For a moment, a dangerous, reckless moment, I considered walking away, leaving them to their war with Julian. But then, the image of Leo surfaced again. Gaunt, dying. His life held in stasis by a vampire's poison. The deal was poison. The mission was poison. But the cure for my brother was real. I was trapped. My objective hadn't changed, but my motivation had. This was no longer just a contract. This was personal. I would fulfill my end of the bargain. I would get the cure for Leo. And then Julian Valerius would have a new problem. He would have me. This new knowledge, this betrayal, gave me a grim clarity. Their single-minded focus on revenge was their weakness. Their rage was a tool I could use against them. They were predictable. I could orchestrate their movements, funnel their anger, and use their own fury to tear them apart. With my new plan solidifying in my mind, I carefully, silently began my retreat from the cavern. I slipped back through the dark, treacherous tunnels, my mind a cold machine, recalculating, reassessing. When I finally emerged from the collapsed adit into the cool night air, the world felt different. I was no longer a hunter tracking a beast. I was a soldier on a battlefield preparing to assault a fortified enemy position. This was no longer about survival. It was about annihilation. I checked my gear, the weight of my rifle and the explosives in my pack a grim comfort. There was no turning back now. The point of no return had been crossed the moment I'd accepted Julian's deal. Now, all that was left was to see it through to its bloody end. The assault began just after midnight, under the heavy cloak of the storm I'd been waiting for. Rain fell in thick, driving sheets, and thunder rolled through the valley, a perfect cover for the violence to come. My first task was to seal the trap. Moving with silent efficiency, I planted C4 charges at the 2 alternate exits I'd identified, the ventilation shafts. I used shaped charges, designed not just to cause a cave-in, but to drive the force of the blast inwards, creating an impassable wall of rock and debris. They weren't meant to kill. They were meant to herd. With the back doors sealed, I crept toward the main entrance of the mine, the maw of the beast. From my pack, I pulled a canister grenade. It wasn't explosive. It was worse. I'd filled it with a highly concentrated aerosolized form of wolfsbane extract. I pulled the pin, counted to 2, and lobbed it deep into the mouth of the tunnel. The effect was almost instantaneous. A wave of enraged, pain-filled howls erupted from the depths of the mine. The gas wasn't lethal, but to their hypersensitive nervous systems it was like breathing fire. It was the ultimate provocation, a direct challenge delivered to their doorstep. Just as I'd calculated, they didn't respond with caution. They responded with pure, unthinking rage. The first wave, a vanguard of 5 of the biggest warriors, burst from the mine entrance. They weren't looking for a hidden enemy. They were a tidal wave of fury, charging blindly out into the storm. They charged directly into the kill zone I had prepared in the ruins of the town's main street. The first werewolf's foot hit the pressure plate. The claymore I'd buried under a pile of rubble detonated with a deafening roar, unleashing its payload of silver shrapnel. The street became a slaughterhouse. 2 of the beasts were torn to shreds instantly. The other 3 were grievously wounded, howling and snapping as they tried to rise on mangled limbs. From my concealed position in the 2nd story of a collapsed general store, I opened fire with the Marlin. 1 shot, 1 kill. I put a heavy, aconite-laced slug through the skull of each of the survivors, the crack of my rifle barely audible over the raging storm. The fight had just begun. The sounds of battle drew more of them from the mine. They poured out into the ruined town, their pack discipline shattered by pain and rage, their only instinct to find and tear apart the source of their agony. The ruins of Black Creek became a chaotic, 3-dimensional battlefield. I became a ghost in the storm. I fired 2 shots from the general store, then immediately abandoned the position, rappelling down the back wall as they swarmed the building. I moved through the skeletal remains of houses and alleyways, a deadly phantom in the pouring rain. I would pop up, take a shot, and melt back into the shadows before they could pinpoint my location. It was the kind of urban warfare I'd been trained for, but my enemy was a 7-foot-tall monster that could smell my fear and shrug off wounds that would kill any man. Inside the mine, chaos reigned. My plan was working perfectly. Hearing the sounds of their packmates being slaughtered outside, more of them rushed toward the main entrance. The rest, seeking escape or a way to flank me, ran for the ventilation shafts, only to be met with the thunderous detonations of my C4 charges. The tunnels collapsed, trapping them, panicking them, and splitting the pack in 2. Seizing the moment, I threw a smoke grenade toward the mine entrance, the thick gray cloud obscuring the battlefield. While the remaining werewolves outside were blinded and confused, I slipped past them and into the mine. The narrow tunnels were a death trap. My rifle was too long, too unwieldy. I let it hang on its sling and drew my magnum and the poisoned Kabar. I moved fast, using the map on my tablet, which glowed eerily in the darkness. This was a clearing operation, room by room, tunnel by tunnel. Every corner was a potential ambush. A flash of movement, a guttural snarl, the roar of my revolver filling the confined space. A short, brutal dance of death in the dark, ending with the wet sound of my knife finding its mark. I was a machine, fueled by adrenaline and the promise I'd made to my brother. I was brutally effective, but the cost was high. One of them got inside my guard, its claws tearing through my gear and into my left arm, snapping the bone with an audible crack. The pain was a white-hot explosion behind my eyes. Another one slammed me against a rock wall, the impact cracking my ribs again and driving the air from my lungs. I was bleeding from a dozen smaller cuts, my body a canvas of agony. The last of my stimulants was wearing off, replaced by a deep, bone-aching exhaustion and a tremor in my hands. But I pushed on. Through the pain, through the exhaustion. I knew most of the pack was dead or dying behind me. But the main threat, the head of the snake, was still ahead. Silas was waiting. I staggered into the final, massive cavern. The Alpha's throne room, my broken left arm held tight against my chest. The air was thick with the smell of blood and ozone from the earlier explosions. He was there, just as I knew he would be. Silas. He stood in the center of the cavern, in his monstrous form, waiting for me. The chaos and panic that had consumed his pack had not touched him. He was a pillar of cold, calculating rage in the heart of the storm I had unleashed. He didn't charge. He watched me, his intelligent, glowing eyes taking in my broken body, my ragged breathing. "The bloodsucker sent his hound," he growled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very stones around us. It was not the snarl of a beast, but the voice of a king whose kingdom I had just burned to the ground. "Did he tell you what you were truly here for, human? Did he mention the relic he stole? He took it from my mate's body after he had her killed. Is that the kind of master you serve?" His words hit me harder than any physical blow. He had her killed. Julian hadn't just robbed a grave. He'd orchestrated a murder and then hired me to eliminate the only witnesses, the only ones who sought justice. The depth of the vampire's depravity was a bottomless pit, and I was neck-deep in it. There was nothing to say. My purpose here was beyond words, beyond justification. I raised my rifle with my good arm, my aim unsteady. The fight began. Silas was a whirlwind of dark fur and claws. He was faster and stronger than any of the others, moving with a terrifying grace. He wasn't a berserker. He was a warrior. He feinted, dodged, and used the terrain, trying to get around my weapon, to get inside my range. I was weakened, my movement sluggish from pain and blood loss. I relied on pure instinct, years of ranger training the only thing keeping me alive. I got one shot off from the Marlin. The slug tore a chunk of flesh from his shoulder, but it was a glancing blow. He roared and charged, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. The rifle flew from my grasp, clattering away into the darkness. My .44 was empty. All I had left was the Kabar. We were locked together, a grim parody of a dance. His claws tore at me, and I drove the poisoned knife into his thigh. He howled, but barely flinched. He was too strong, his rage overriding the pain. He threw me across the cavern like a rag doll. I slammed into the rock wall and crumpled to the floor, the world spinning. He was on me in an instant, one massive clawed hand pinning my good arm, the other raised for the killing blow. I was out of options, out of strength. But as I looked past him, I saw them. The old, rusted iron support beams for the mine shaft, the ones the original miners had installed over a century ago. The very ones I had noted on my map as a structural weakness. With the last ounce of my strength, I wasn't fighting him. I was moving him. I kicked and twisted not to escape, but to shift our struggle a few feet to the left. Just as he brought his claws down, I used my legs to shove us backward, directly into the path of one of the crumbling beams. His killing blow missed, his claws gouging deep furrows in the rock beside my head. His momentum, combined with my push, carried his massive body backward. He slammed into the rusted iron support with incredible force. The beam groaned, buckled, and then snapped. The ceiling above us gave way with a deafening crack. Rocks and debris rained down. Silas was momentarily stunned, disoriented by the unexpected cave-in, looking up as the mountain itself seemed to come down upon us. It was the only opening I would get. Ignoring the fire in my lungs and the grinding of my broken bones, I surged forward. Not with a wild swing, but with a trained, precise lunge. I didn't aim for his chest or back. I aimed for the one vulnerable point I could reach. I drove the poisoned Ka-bar up under his jaw, plunging it deep into the soft tissue of his throat, putting every last bit of my body weight behind the thrust. The blade, slick with aconite, sank to the hilt. A terrible, wet, gurgling sound escaped him. The light of battle in his eyes flickered. He staggered back, clawing at the knife embedded in his throat. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second the monster was gone. I saw only the man, the husband, his eyes filled with a profound human suffering. Then they went glassy and vacant. The great alpha of the Ashwood pack crashed to the cavern floor, stone dead. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and the drip of blood, his and mine. I stood over his body, swaying on my feet, the world a gray, wavering tunnel, the contract. I needed the proof. With my one good hand, I reached down, gripped one of his massive canine teeth, and with a sickening crack of bone, twisted it free. The Alpha's fang was slick with blood in my palm. My trophy, my sin. The journey back was a fever dream painted in shades of pain. Adrenaline and the last of the stimulants had been replaced by a system-wide crash. Every mile in the rattling cab of my truck was an exercise in agony. My broken arm was a useless, throbbing weight. My ribs screamed with every breath. I kept myself awake by focusing on one image: the silver vial Julian had given me, and the promise of Leo's cure. That was the only thing that mattered. I didn't go to an emergency room. I couldn't. I drove straight back to Boston, straight to the Viper's Nest. I took the private elevator up to Julian's penthouse, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on his pristine marble floor. He was waiting for me, standing by the window just as before, a glass of dark red liquid in his hand. He looked me over, his ancient eyes taking in my wrecked state with a flicker of what might have been surprise, or perhaps just cold appraisal. "So," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "the dog returns from the hunt." I didn't have the strength for words. I reached into my pocket and threw the Alpha's fang onto the polished glass of his coffee table. It landed with a heavy click, stark and bloody against the clean surface. "Your pest control is done," I rasped. Julian picked up the fang, examining it with detached satisfaction. "Excellent," he murmured, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You are even more thorough than I'd hoped, Mr. Whitaker. A truly remarkable talent for destruction." He turned and walked to an ornate antique cabinet. From a velvet-lined drawer, he produced a heavy, dark wood case. He opened it and presented it to me. Inside, nestled on a bed of crushed black velvet, was a large, antique-looking syringe with silver fittings. It was filled with a pearlescent, shimmering fluid that seemed to glow with its own faint internal light. "The full dose," Julian said, "as promised. It will do precisely what I said it would. It will rewrite his genetic code, purge the affliction. When he awakens, his body will be whole again." I snatched the case from his hands and turned to leave. "A word of advice, Mr. Whitaker," Julian called after me. "Get yourself to a doctor. You look like hell." I ignored him. I had one destination, one purpose. Getting into the hospital was harder this time. I was a walking casualty, and my story about a hiking accident was paper thin. I bribed a night shift orderly with the last of my cash to look the other way while I slipped into Leo's room. He looked worse than ever. The stasis field of the initial dose had clearly collapsed. His skin was pale as death, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The monitor beside him beeped a slow, failing rhythm. He was losing. There was no time to waste. My hands trembled from pain and exhaustion as I prepped the large syringe. The pearlescent liquid looked otherworldly in the dim light of the room. I found the IV port, my heart hammering against my broken ribs, and pushed the plunger. The reaction was not the gentle healing I had prayed for. It was instantaneous and violent. Leo's body arched off the bed, rigid as a board, a choked, inhuman scream tearing from his throat. The heart monitor flatlined with a piercing shriek, then went haywire, the lines jumping chaotically across the screen. His skin, already pale, bleached to a stark, corpse-like white. The veins on his neck and arms darkened, turning a sickening, bruised black under the skin. He was convulsing, his limbs thrashing against the restraints with terrifying strength. This wasn't healing. This was a violation. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He fell back against the pillows, silent and still. For a terrible moment, I thought he was dead. I thought, after everything, I had killed him. He opened his eyes. They weren't Leo's eyes anymore. The gentle blue I knew was gone, replaced by a solid, burning crimson that glowed with a predatory light. He looked at me, but he didn't see his brother. He saw food. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a snarl, revealing canines that were unnaturally long, unnaturally sharp. The horror of it crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. The regenerative infusion. The rewriting of his genetic code. It was all true, in the most monstrous way imaginable. Julian hadn't cured him, he'd converted him. The cure for the echo of one monster was the curse of another. Vampirism. Cole. The name was a pained, hungry hiss. He launched himself at me from the bed, his movements a blur of newfound, unnatural speed. But he was weak, disoriented by his new senses and the raging thirst. Despite my injuries, my sentinel instinct screamed, and I reacted, shoving him back. He stumbled and fell, his new body clumsy and uncoordinated. I stared at the creature cowering on the floor, the thing that wore my brother's face. The grief in my chest was a black hole, but through it another feeling rose, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. A pure, undiluted, all-consuming rage. It wasn't directed at the monster on the floor. It was for the monster in the penthouse. I had saved my brother from death, only to damn him to an eternity of hunger. I had traded one curse for another. The first priority was containment. The creature that was my brother was a newborn vampire, driven by a singular, overwhelming instinct: hunger. I couldn't hurt him, not seriously, but I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. In the ensuing chaos of the flatlining monitor and his scream, I acted fast. I struck him hard at the base of the skull, a non-lethal blow I'd learned in Ranger CQC, enough to render him unconscious. I disabled the alarms, created a mess to look like a desperate escape, and bundled his limp form in a hospital blanket. Smuggling him out was a nightmarish feat of stealth and brute strength. I got him into the back of my truck and drove, leaving Boston and my old life burning in the rearview mirror. There was only one place to go: back to the Whitaker homestead in Massachusetts. The house was isolated, secure, and the basement, the armory, was more than a workshop. Behind another false wall was a relic of the Cold War, a small, lead-lined fallout shelter reinforced with steel, a perfect cell. When Leo woke up, it was to a nightmare. He was in the shelter, the heavy steel door bolted from the outside. He screamed, not just from hunger, but from confusion and terror. He didn't understand the burning thirst, the new strength thrumming in his limbs, the way the sliver of daylight from the high, barred window felt like a physical blow. I had to watch through the small, reinforced viewport as my little brother, clawed at the walls, his eyes glowing red with a torment I had inflicted upon him. All the grief, all the guilt, it didn't dissipate. It crystallized. It hardened into a new purpose, a single, burning objective that eclipsed everything else. Julian Valerius. This was no longer about a contract or a deal. It was about vengeance. He hadn't just used me. He hadn't just lied to me. He had taken my love for my brother and twisted it into a weapon to create another monster for his collection. He had made me the instrument of my own damnation. I had destroyed an entire people for a lie, and the vampire would pay for it, in blood. I went back to the armory, back to the codex, but this time, I didn't open it to the chapter on lycanthropies. I turned the brittle pages to the section my father had marked with a skull and crossbones, De Nosferatu Progenitorum, the progenitor vampires. I read about their ancient lineages, their incredible strength, their hypnotic abilities. I read about their weaknesses, sunlight, fire, the wood of an ancient ash tree, and a stake through the heart, not because it was magic, but because it was the one injury their regenerative abilities couldn't overcome if it pinned them. Most importantly, I read about their psychology. They were creatures of ego and power. To kill a patriarch like Julian in a straight fight was impossible. He was too old, too strong, too well defended. I had to dismantle his world first. I had to bleed his power, destroy his assets, and undermine the very foundation of his immortality. My mind raced. Silas's dying words echoed in my ears. The moon gift. A stolen relic. Julian had enemies. The Ashwood Pack couldn't have been the only ones he'd crossed over the centuries. Perhaps the enemy of my enemy could be a temporary and disposable ally. My hunt for Julian wouldn't be a swift assault. It would be a campaign, a war fought from the shadows. But the most pressing problem remained, locked in my basement. Leo. His cries of hunger were a constant, agonizing reminder of my failure. What was I going to do? Could the curse be reversed? The Codex was silent on that. Could I keep him supplied with blood, stolen from blood banks, bought on the black market, to keep him from becoming a predator? For how long? Or would I one day have to make the most terrible choice a sentinel could ever face? As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood at the armory window looking out at a sunrise my brother might never see again without pain. The light caught the metal of the revolver I was cleaning. The hunt for the werewolves was over. Their ghosts would haunt me forever. But a new hunt had just begun. I ejected the spent 44 casings, the symbols of my contract with Julian. From a locked box, I took out a new set of ammunition. I had crafted them years ago, following a particularly dark chapter in the Codex. The slugs were not silver. They were carved from the dense, petrified heartwood of an ancient ash tree, felled by lightning. Each one had been soaked in holy water and tipped with a core of solidified, consecrated salt. I loaded the revolver, the heavy rounds clicking into place with grim finality, 1 for Julian, and 5 for anyone who stood in my way.